Monday, so we'll have Colin Dixon back on in just a moment to talk about the business of streaming. Today we have a fantastic show. We have Morgan Kruger, who is COO of MWM Universe. Colin, of course, is Chief Analyst at nScreenMedia, and they're going to dive into some elements about how to launch engaging shows that with community around streaming. So let me turn it over to Colin Dixon.
Thank you very much, Ned, and welcome everybody. Happy lunchtime. As Ned said, we're talking to Morgan Kruger. Morgan is COO of Madison Wells Media Universe. And Morgan, if you'd love to, hopefully you can unmute yourself and we can all see you. There you go. Morgan, yeah. Welcome to us. Could you do a quick introduction to yourself and more important, well, just as importantly, to Madison Wells Media?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Morgan Kruger. I am the COO of the Universe Division of Madison Wells Media, MWM. Madison Wells Media is a diversified media company that operates businesses across the sort of traditional film and television with our studios division that has produced Drive, Ender's Game, Hell or High Water. We have a live division as well, involved in original and co-productions, Broadway and off-Broadway, $1 Million Quartet, the recent Company, Hadestown, The Inheritance have all been worked on out of that division. And then our interactive division that does VR and game publishing as well. And then the Universe division, what we do is, the other divisions are really platform specific. You know, we make film or we make games. The Universe division is platform agnostic. What we're really trying to do is build franchises in a world where everybody understands the value of intellectual property. We really try to maximize that value and optimize it for where the media industry is going, which is more and more platforms and sources and portals for people to get content through. Not all of it long form video content, and trying to build franchises for that world.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to jump in. We're going to jump in and talk about those universes in just a second. Great. I want to just remind everybody, if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A window. Also, feel free, we encourage you, please introduce yourself through the chat window. Let everybody know that you're there. So anyway, don't forget to enter your questions through the Q&A window. So let's start with the universe concept. This is one of the things I absolutely love about what you do. You don't just build a streaming show. You create an entire universe. Now you're right in the middle of doing that with Hebrew Brantley's Flyboy, right? So maybe you can talk us through a little bit about what was the motivation with working with that character, and where you see that going, and then we can broaden it out and talk about how that works out into a multimedia world.
Yeah, absolutely. So Hebrew Brantley's Flyboy it's a great sort of case study for what it is that the Universe division does. There's an artist, Hebrew Brantley, whose work is showcased in galleries around the form of fine art. He also does collaborations with Billionaire Boys Club, Bathing Ape, etc. So he has a pretty robust merchandise side of his business. The character Flyboy itself is extraordinarily eye-catching and iconographic with this green helmet and yellow goggles. And it's something that a lot of people have responded to, and you could see a franchise being built around that. And the question for a creator like that is, you could just go and sell a piece of your rights to a film studio, or you could partner with somebody like us to help do the work of building out that audience, building out that franchise, so that you're walking in with a bit of a franchise already having been laid out. So in that case, because he had this fan base they were extraordinarily passionate about finding ways to engage with the merchandise, and they would stand outside in line for hours in order to experience and buy the merchandise. We knew that we had an audience that was willing to go to a physical place to be a part of something, and they also didn't see Flyboy as a story world character. So our job was to introduce the story aspects of that character, but then also draft off of the existing consumer behavior of showing up to a place in public. So we decided to create this design installation that's not dissimilar from a Meow Wolf or a Museum of Ice Cream, but with a really story-forward component. And so we opened that up in October of last year in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and not just the installation, but producing the website around it, the social media around it. We have a graphic novel that we're starting to go out to people with. So a lot of different elements of it coming together. So it's not just producing the one thing, it's producing the owned audience that exists around that thing as well, so that you speak to the people that you are creating content for, and you can follow them from place to place.
So that's really interesting. It sounds like you're starting a little bit small to test the waters and then growing from there. Is that the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so.
Okay. So you start small, you test the waters, you keep your investment low. At what point, where does streaming fit in? Where does a streaming production come from in that process? What are the means tests that have to be taken and passed before you greenlight that? And what do you do? What sort of thing do you develop?
Right. Well, I think it's never as simple as a one size fits all decision tree of, you do X with a franchise and then it passes a test and it makes sense to move to streaming at Y point. It really depends on what the market of streaming is looking for as well, because it has to be done in conjunction with and sort of symbiotic with the needs of the streamers and what audiences they're looking to develop for their individual streaming services. And so something that, it might make sense in a vacuum to go to streaming in 4 years. If they're looking for something now or in a year from now, those can all be, we can always develop franchises with that in mind. We are not creating content in a vacuum. We're creating it in collaboration with an entire ecosystem. But I think that what streaming really does is it does two things very well. It has a tremendous footprint, a distribution footprint that allows a lot of people to have access to something. And it also is a great way to tell stories. Ultimately, long-form video content serves the function of a one-to-many storytelling platform. Whereas social media is a bit more about community engagement and a back and forth with that audience. Gaming is a bit more about being interactive and deeply immersive into a space. Publishing is a bit more about having the intimacy of something in your home, in the form of a book that you read before you go to bed at night. Each platform does something different, and I would say streaming is about really fabulous storytelling and a way to get people invested in characters, and then also that distribution footprint.
Very good. So let's stay with the streaming aspect for a little bit. I mean, it is the business of streaming today, so we'll probably talk about that a lot. So let's talk about production. You actually do produce streaming shows already, right? The Dragon Prince, which has been tremendously successful, as far as I can see, on Netflix. Tell us a little bit about that show and what you're doing there.
Yeah, so that's one where we have an early and long time relationship with the creators of that show. It's Aaron Ahaz, Justin Richmond, and Justin Santesteven are the founders of a company, Wonderstorm. And we invested with Wonderstorm, and from the very beginning had a real understanding that we were on the same page as them about how you build community and franchise. So they're a great example of, they had a streaming show first, and then they were able to build out the publishing program, the social media, the fan art, the fan fiction, and then the game as well. And so that's one where we had a very similar vision to them, and it's been a fabulous collaboration.
So that's been very successful. Now, tell us some of the other things that you develop at MWM Universe, some of the other products, as it were. And then I want to ask you. So maybe you can fill that out a little bit, and then I want to ask you about how you've been impacted by the shelter in place orders and all of that. So let's start off with, give us an idea of some of the products. You mentioned comic books and streaming. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So another, a good sort of example of what we do is the franchise Voyage to the Stars. That is a original sci-fi comedy podcast. We have 5 fabulous improv comedians who get a light outline created by the creator Ryan Koppel, and they fill it in with sort of sci-fi hijinks. We are now entering our 3rd season. It's been coming out for a year, multiple millions of downloads. It's been a fabulous success. But that's one, when we started the Universe division only 2 years ago, we really wanted to understand what it took to build a brand from scratch, so that as we went, we were able to, whether we built more brands from scratch or partnered with others who had already built brands, we knew the work that it took to do it. So again, Voyage to the Stars hadn't existed before, whereas in the case of Flyboy, that was an already existing property where we were partnering with the creator. And in the case of Voyage to the Stars, it was not just producing the podcast, it was producing the social media, the website, the merchandise, which is a fabulous way of drawing your fans and your community farther into the world, in addition to an additional sort of monetization stream. And then we're also doing a comic book with IDW exploring card games and video games. And so that's one where it really shows the work that we put into the heavy lift of taking something from a 0 to a 5 from a brand creation perspective.
I'm glad you mentioned Voyage to the Stars, because I love it. I love Felicia Day. She's wonderful. That's something, and I suspect Dragon Prince to some extent. These are shows that really couldn't have existed, I think, in the old way, the old broadcast way, where we had very limited bandwidth, and everything's chopped up into a schedule, and that's the only way you could get things out. These types of shows really couldn't exist in that type of environment,
right?
But they can today, because we have, in effect, infinite bandwidth,
right?
So that's a really great difference between the old and new world.
Absolutely.
How does that impact how you go about using those shows and marketing those shows?
Yeah, well, it's a great point that you bring up, because it's something I see that as fundamental to the thesis of what we're doing in the Universe Group. That it used to be that there were 5 broadcast networks. And slowly that turned into 5 broadcast networks and 50 cable channels, and then 300 cable channels. And so there's been this slow, but then very sudden with the internet, proliferation of distribution access points. And it used to be that you could put Friends on NBC Thursday nights at 8, and 15, 20 million people would watch it of 100 million households, and you would collect a lot of money in advertising revenue from a sort of really kind of a singular or a few secondary and tertiary monetization points from this massive audience that you'd aggregated, because it didn't have many other places to go. And that was it. That was your business model. It was fabulous. But now, as the number of distribution access points for content has proliferated to the point of infinity, the audiences are by necessity going to get a lot smaller. They're going to emerge, or rather than 15, 20 million at a time, it's going to be 100,000. It can get up into the millions. There'll be other sort of Game of Thrones that aggregate audience again and act as these water cooler moments. But there will also be significant audiences of a smaller size. It can be 200,000, it can be 1 million, 2 million, but it doesn't need to be 20 million. That's no longer a sort of a necessity of success. And so when you create for smaller audiences, you can't just rely on the singular business model of being advertising supported. It needs to be something that smaller groups of people care a tremendous amount about. That was something that I really saw and learned when I was at Hulu, that what you need is the content that groups of people will crawl over glass to get to. That it's the content that they care above all other things. So rather than the show that 10 people, it's on their top 10 list, You need to show that a person, it's on their, the thing that they most care about. And then you can build a business model around it, not by monetizing just a smaller group, in which case it feels like the pie has just gotten smaller, but rather by monetizing all of the different aspects of the way that they can engage in that franchise. Again, whether it's the merchandise and the e-commerce that you own the pipeline for, or it's the publishing program that really ties into the franchise and into the TV series in an extraordinarily organic, authentic way. Those are all of the things that we seek to build, and the reason that we exist as a division.
Boy, there's a lot in what you just said to unpack. Actually, I wanted to insert a quick question from the audience. Thank you for this. Can universe franchise building start with a streaming show, or does it need to start with a book or game or theatrical release, or an art installation as you did with Flyboy? Can it start with straight into streaming?
Yeah, I think the Dragon Prince is a fabulous example of that. They'd started with a Netflix series pickup. That they were able to, Wonderstorm were able to retain the rights to build out the franchise around it. So they own that that digital real estate of the social media. They were then able to build a publishing program off of that. They were then able to build the e-commerce and the merchandise piece off of that, and then the game as well. And so I think there's many different ways to get to this endpoint that we see of a sort of a symbiotic relationship between a really robust community strategy and a streaming world.
Okay, so you mentioned community, so I really want to, you knew that I was going to ask you about this, because this is one aspect, particularly for smaller audiences, when you're trying to reach smaller audiences. I always think that community is a really critical part. So talk about, for example, with Flyboy, there was already a very identified community around that. How do you work with that community to grow your business and that community in your business? How do you go about doing that?
That's such a big question. It always depends on the community and how they engage and what they engage in. You know, I used to think of, coming from old media as I did, I used to think of audiences as these big swaths of people, you know, whether it's 4-quadrant or young and old, male, female. But then being at Hulu, you really see the variegated quilt of human interest, human consumer behavior types, human activities. And so everybody is so different, and communities are the same way. Some of them, like the Dragon Prince, really wants to engage in fan art. Or they really want to engage in fan fiction. They want to be a part of the community by creating around it. Some people want to engage in the community by showing off the merchandise that they've bought, which I think Flyboy is a little closer to that. And so it was really clear to us that, you know, having a fabulous merchandise program was going to be a really important part of the design installation that we put together. So it very much depends on the existing audience behaviors in that community, and then the ones that you're trying to lean into or follow on from that.
It's interesting you bring that up. Paul Craig actually had a very interesting question. He asks, how does merchandise and sponsorship from brands play into how you would put together finance for a project? There's a big question.
That is a big question. I think that it's, you're going to hate me for doing the it depends answer as but I would say sponsorship is a tough one because it's a really imperfect marketplace. You have to, it's sort of the way that bartering is a inefficient means of trading value because it requires a coincidence of wants. Sponsorship also requires the same thing, that that a brand is looking for the same thing that you as a company are trying to do. So it's something that we're always open to, but it's harder to rely on. I see e-commerce as something that it requires a larger scale of interest because there are startup costs. Even if you do print on demand, it still requires the setup of the website, the merchandise design. So it requires a scale, but what it really does is allow you to be and to act as an independent operator when you're able to control that revenue stream, and also that way of drawing your community deeper down the pipeline of the thing that they will eventually crawl over glass to get to. It doesn't need to be a licensing moment where it's the logo sort of put on a pillowcase. It can be something that draws people further into the world.
Right, right. How important is the community in being found? And I don't just mean within the community, I mean outside of the community, because, you know, I suppose we could think, I mean, perhaps you can answer this as well. Is it right to think about the community that's existing around the content as being kind of your core customers, and then there are customers outside of that core community to reach? So this is, I'm very interested in exploring how community helps you be found.
Right. I think it's, to speak to that last point of how community helps you be found, if you are a story world or a brand or a franchise that people care about so much they will crawl over glass to get to it, they will also talk about it with other people. So then your community is acting as your evangelizers. That's the most purest form of organic marketing that you could possibly get. And so absolutely community can act as a way for you to be found. To your earlier question around, you know, how all the different marketing touch points, you know, it really does need to be everything. It needed to be everything before in a pre-COVID world, and it needs to be everything now, you know, whether that's press outlets, paid marketing, depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve, the owned audiences of the talent that you're working with, the owned audiences of other people that you sort of bring into the franchise and the story world. All of those act as really important ways of building up a community and growing it over time.
So I want you to put your Hulu hat on. Does that change for Hulu? How Hulu is found by customers is pretty different to the way a small service is found, or is that not true? And what sort of strategies did Hulu employ that may work for smaller services and may not work for smaller services?
Yeah, and Hulu is in a fundamentally different position because it's trying to be, it's holding the medium constant, long form video, but it is trying to be an aggregator to as many people as possible. So it's a little bit different in that it's trying to be the thing that a lot of people care about enough in a lot of different ways. And so a conventional wisdom is that original content, which is oftentimes the thing that people will crawl over glass to get to in the form of something that, you know, whether there's a star in it that you really love, or it's based on a series of books that you really feel passionately about. Original content is oftentimes the thing that gets people in the door. But then it's in many ways the longer tail content, or the sort of the kind of background content that keeps people subscribing every month thereafter. You know, something like a long running true crime show, like an investigation discovery style show, is not necessarily the thing that somebody would subscribe to Hulu for, but it is absolutely the thing that will keep them subscribing month after month.
So am I right?
It's true of aggregators generally, that you need to be a lot of different things to your audience. I oftentimes thought of the job to be done, which is a sort of a business school concept that I really took to heart. The job to be done of an aggregator like a Hulu needs to be everything to everybody. And so it's not just a TV show that you watch to watch these, a service that you subscribe to watch a sort of prestige cable drama. It's also, it needs to be the thing that you put in front of your children as a bit of a temporary babysitter. It needs to be the TV show you watch in the background while you're folding the laundry. It needs to be all of those things in order to be a part of your life.
So it sounds like at Hulu, when you were going after specific content, you probably had, did you have that content like categorized in those buckets? What does this do me? This is a great piece of content for new subscriber acquisition. This is a piece of content that will keep people watching. Did you do that? And that was why you were going after the content?
Absolutely. It's you think of it not just in terms of, or I personally thought of it not just in terms of what is the goal of this content? Is it to get new people to subscribe, or is it to engage our existing subscribers? You would also think of it in terms of what audience base is this for? Is this for people who are fans of this other show, or is it to strengthen an existing content offering that we have, or is it to break ground into a new content offering? And then also, what is the job to be done? Is this background content? Is this sort of prestige, come home from a long day of work and this is your hour of break? Is this your kind of guilty pleasure? Where does this fit into the lives of our consumers, and how they relate to Hulu as a streaming service?
Very good. So I wanted to move into your sort of general. Obviously, you have quite a broad streaming background, having worked for Disney and worked for Hulu and now MWM. Talk to us a little bit about the role of. I want to get into talk about distribution and how you pick the right distribution path for the content that you have. And many choices. You've mentioned some already. Of course, there's aggregation sites. There's there's free ad-supported sites like Pluto TV. There's Amazon channels if you have an O&O. There's an owned and operated site. Talk to us about the balance between those and how you might think about them in distributing content through MWM Universe.
Yeah, it's a great, big, broad question.
It is.
It's I hate to go back to the "it depends" answer, but it always does. Some of the things that I think about in coming up with that sort of calculus is what are the sort of monetization goals, and that may be as much as in many ways tied to how much money are we spending on this up front. The idea of creating a high sort of six-figure long-form content TV series and putting it up on YouTube for free, that may generate a lot of eyeballs because it's on a service with a lot of eyeballs, but it's not going to work for a sort of a monetization or a business schema. And so those things are always in conflict with each other. The broadness of the distribution footprint that you're able to achieve, and the ability to monetize it. And there's always, there's all sorts of players who are coming to the forefront with new business models that allow you to be behind walled gardens in some ways. So that may not offer you the ability to have your content in front of as many eyeballs, but it offers you the ability to monetize it earlier on. So you're always making those trade-offs, the ability to build audience, and then the ability, on the other hand, to monetize and build a business around that audience, which ultimately makes you, building a business around your audience ultimately allows you to be sustainable. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is the sustainability of the media industry in the long term.
That to me sounds like, I think, a defining theme right now, where our industry is right now, the sustainability. One of the fascinating things, we've been through this evolution in streaming. We've sort of started out with the SVOD services where it was subscription only. Now, just in the last couple of years, or in the last year and a half, the emphasis has really switched to AVOD as we fill out the panoply of the way people can engage with content. Of course, we've always had e-commerce and rental. I'm really interested in exploring the balance between these, and maybe you can think a little bit ahead. Are more services going to appear that are blending models? Are we going to get away from these mono monetization models and get a more blended approach? And do you think that that's the right way to go, or do you think that there are times when subscription is the best way and you should really just focus on that?
Yeah. When you say AVOD, do you mean like the blended Quibi AVOD models or the blended Hulu AVOD models?
I'm thinking more of really free, and Quibi is a great example, right? Because it's a blended model, just like Hulu is a blended model.
Right.
Although I will say, very interesting, while you were there, I think Hulu quit providing any free content. That was a very interesting decision to me.
Right.
So it's really this idea of free access versus paid access. and how you balance those two and how you see that evolving.
Yeah, I think there's a very real, I think oftentimes of the media industry is this sort of convection oven with things sort of rising and falling at all times.
Great image.
With AVOD, I think that oftentimes it is driven by a desire to own eyeballs as they move. Generally in the media industry right now, there has been an owned ecosystem of linear broadcast distribution access points, and that's moving to an all digital model. And I think people all media companies are focused on owning the eyeballs in this sort of new digital ecosystem, and how their strategy of getting them from where the eyeballs were, sort of the old cable linear broadcast ecosystem to a more digital one. I think it varies by the company and what cash reserves it has on hand to subsidize that movement, and what their underlying businesses are that they're trying to protect, or that they have a leg up in. A company that already has an enormous ad sales team is probably going to be a fan of an AVOD model because they have a ton of ad sales supply that they can create new inventory for. And so it's as much dependent on the sort of short, medium, and long-term goals of the companies who are trying to weather this transition from linear to digital as it is anything else.
Right. So I've got one more question for you before we go to, I've got lots more audience questions. Please keep them coming. They're really good. I wanted to talk a little bit more about marketing. So we talked about the community aspect of it. There's a couple of areas I wanted to explore. One is for a smaller service particularly, but you can also please expound on what you think Hulu's doing about marketing in this particular moment in history where many people are locked down. I've seen a lot of data. I just saw data today from Parks Associates that said now 50% of the people, more than 50% of people that have broadband have more than one service. So they have 2 or more services, and actually 20% have 4 or more. So there's clearly a big marketing opportunity right now to establish a bigger audience. Are there any differences? Would you go about it differently based on where we are, where we were, say, 2 months ago?
It's a good question. One thing that's always difficult is the time delay of if you put a sort of marketing schema in place now. If you do it right, it'll often pay off 3-4 months from now. Right. And so to know the activities that you'll take place now, that whether and to what extent they'll pay off, or whether and to what extent will still be under how extreme the shelter-in-place sort of orders will be at that point. Marketing is always the hardest part of it. Getting people to care is always the hardest part, and making them aware and then making them feel extraordinarily passionate. It's always going to be the most challenging part of our jobs. I don't know that the entire landscape has changed so much as the levers that we're pulling are a little bit different. Before we would have spent a lot more energy on, a convention schedule, and how are we going to get in front of people in people who are open to exploring and finding a new franchise in a real place where you can create this really intimate connection. We're going to sort of shift some of that focus to how can we find to essentially an influencer campaign, but how can we find people who are most likely to care as much about this franchise and talk about it on the internet, talk about it in places where people are talking about things. And again, knowing that there's such a sort of a oversaturation of content right now, because everybody is on the internet generally right now. We used to, there were certain services where we knew we would be able to get front page placement, whereas now, major celebrities and stars who otherwise wouldn't have deigned to spend time on that platform are now jumping on. And so it's a lot harder to to guarantee that you're going to be able to get in front of people the same way that you used to.
Yeah, one of the things I absolutely love, I'm really enjoying right now, is the way many services are leaning into just making their service available for free for the next month or the next 90 days. Sling TV has really been leaning into the free. It seems that's a win-win for everybody. It's a win for customers, consumers who want more content. It's a win for the services. So
absolutely,
that's a really great way to go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is while we are answering your questions, and boy, there are some good ones here. Please keep them coming. I'm going to put up a poll. And there's just 3 questions that are sort of loosely based on the conversation that Morgan and I have just had. So Morgan, maybe you can confirm that you're seeing the poll. Are you actually seeing it pop up?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, okay. Here we go. How about now?
Yeah, there we go.
There you can see it. Very good. Okay. So while people are answering those poll questions, a very interesting question from Mark Rashba. He asks, does Madison Wells only look to new IP or thinking about reviving dormant IP that needs help? That's a great question.
No, we are absolutely open to all forms of IP. You know, there's entirely new IP in the form of Voyage to the Stars, the brand we created. There is sort of nascent, existing, but getting its legs IP in the form of something like a Flyboy. But we're absolutely interested as well in dormant IP. There's a lot of brands that have a lot of name recognition, but haven't necessarily found that audience that they can control and speak to and own on a sort of direct-to-consumer basis. And so we're also interested in those. Additionally, brands that do speak to their audience, but are interested in sort of bringing this direct-to-consumer franchise thesis to life. You know, they have an audience already. They're already maybe doing a publishing program, but they want to expand into e-commerce, or they want to expand into TV and film, or expand that audience and touch point base. We're also open to working with those as well. So we're open to a lot of different options.
Right, right. I noticed that's actually one of the things that some of the movie producers are moving into as well. MGM, for example, the Stargate franchise now has a home online. They created a brand new series for it. And I think they're probably developing some of their other properties that are, I guess you would call them dormant, into new vibrant communities online.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move to the next question. Beverly she asks, what is your take on unlicensed fan creations and the balance between encouraging community engagement and monetization? Oh boy, there's a thorny question.
It's a thorny one, but I think it's easier than it used to be. And then I think when we were in a very sort of simple distribution ecosystem, it was a bit more clear cut of we, the companies, you know, project the content to you, the consumers, and it's a bit of a one-way broadcast, literally and figuratively. And I think that in this, what we're trying to foster is community. And so to us, if somebody is creating fan art, that's a beautiful thing. We want to encourage that because that allows them to build a community around it. And I think if you are building a community the right way, those creators are people, you know, you commission them to do merchandise that they are able to monetize, that you're able to monetize. It can be much more of a two-way street, I think, than it used to be, and it needs to be that as well.
Did you think about that differently when you were at Hulu?
I certainly thought about it differently when I was at Disney.
Sure.
At Hulu, we were more about a particular consumer behavior as opposed to IP protection.
Right.
And so at Hulu, it was, we just want people to watch our. We weren't as focused on building that sort of that community love and community fan base. But I think that's why what it is that MWMU does is so symbiotic with what a Netflix or a Hulu is doing, an aggregator, because they're trying to do one thing, one particular consumer behavior across a lot of different franchises, and we're trying to stoke that passion over long periods of time for one franchise at a time, or a few sort of
Right.
made franchises.
Right. It seems even for the big producers, it seems like the opinion about a fan created content has really evolved a lot over the last 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot more permissive now, I think.
Truly, it's not just permissive; it's encouraged. I think it should be, because if somebody is willing to take their time and their talent to make a piece of fan art around an IP that you are building out, that's a way of people showing that they will crawl over glass to get to it.
Yeah.
Want to be a part of that world. And that's what we're always trying to, that's the hardest thing in the world to create, and what we're always in sort of striving to create as we go.
Right. Well, we'll do one more question, I think, and then we'll end the poll and we'll take a look at the poll results. So this is a great question. Michael Holton asks, do you look for brand worlds that are synergistic, either by customer base or type of brand, such as environment focused or whatever? So what do you look for?
Brand worlds that are synergistic to anything in particular, or are we looking for a particular type of brand or world?
I think he's sort of just asking, what are the synergistic traits that you look for in branded worlds?
Yeah, I would say for the universe division, there isn't, we're not looking only for content that fits into a particular genre. The brands that we have right now, there's sort of a magical realist brand, I would say, in the form of Flyboy, with sort of superhero undercurrents. Voyage to the Stars is animated sci-fi comedy. It's very blue. We are very interested in the romance publishing space, which I think is an underutilized, that is interested in spending money and being engaged further. We have content that's in the anime space, so we really run the gamut. We're across a broad spectrum of brands that we look at in the universe division, and some of them may work really well for the other groups at the company, but that's not exclusively how we determine the content that comes into the universe division.
Wow, lots of opportunity, I hear. lots of places to go that have not been explored yet.
Yeah.
Morgan, this has been awesome. I'm going to end the poll now, and we're going to take a quick look at the poll results. So here we go. I'm going to share the results with everybody, and let's see what we got. I asked, how many smaller niche pay services will people ultimately have in their personal content bundles? And very few people seem to think nobody's going to go for niche. Everybody seems, it looks like the plurality, I got it out in the end, is 2 with 35%. And, yeah, definitely 2 or more seems to be what people are thinking there. And I think I absolutely agree. For me, I'm going to have my 2 or 3 core services and layer on it 2 or 3 more that really serve my particular interest.
Absolutely.
Is that your view? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's always going to depend on the person and what their other interests are. But I think that people are going to have broad-based interests, like in the form of a Netflix or a Hulu aggregator. But then they're also going to have very specific interests that aren't well served by big aggregators.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed, for example, your show, The Dragon Prince, there's not a lot of anime type content on and cartoon content on Netflix. So there's plenty of room for other services like Crunchyroll, for example.
Like a Crunchyroll, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, how important is it for smaller services to be active and encouraging to the community? Well, I think this was a loaded question for this audience, don't you think, Morgan? 78%,
Absolutely.
It's a critical. Absolutely nobody thinks it's unimportant. So I think we don't need to say anything more about that.
Right.
And which is the most important distribution channel for smaller services? And this one, wow, this is very interesting.
Very split.
Much more divided, right? Looks like people seem to think that connected TV platforms like Roku, Samsung Smart TVs, Fire TV and Apple TV are very important, which I think I totally agree. But
Right.
I yes, well, what do you think? It's very split, isn't it?
Yeah, I tend to agree with the poll that it seems so split, also because a smaller service, the three that come to mind immediately are something like a British-based service like an Acorn TV, where it's really just about the content, versus something like the Korean drama style service, where it's as much about the kind of gossipy exploration of the talent in the content as the content itself. Whereas others are going to be a bit more plugged into merchandise elements. Maybe that's almost like a Rooster Teeth. And I think each of those will depend on what their best distribution channel is. But if I had to pick one, gun to my head, it would probably be just a connected TV platform like a Roku.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I eke out agreement with the group on that one.
Very good. Morgan, this has been such an enjoyable conversation. Thank you
For me as
so
well.
much for joining us today.
My
and
pleasure.
I hope we can drag you back and do something similar in the very near future. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ned.
Thanks.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Colin. Very engaging. I loved all the questions, and we had an active chat going as well today. I'm just letting folks know we have not announced the speaker yet for tomorrow's show because just working out some final elements, but we will be announcing that shortly. So we'll be back tomorrow at noon Pacific. We have another terrific week planned for folks. So have a great day. Stay safe, everybody.